Welcome to part 6 of a series of short videos helping you as one of our volunteers to bulk up on your knowledge or just have a recap ready for a trip to the shore. This is going to be an overview of the different types of shells in general. There are plenty of shells which can look very similar, so this is a very basic guide indeed. So where to look for shells? Have a look again in the Strandline. It's always a handy place to find some shells. Some shells you'll find attached to hydroids. So these are little colonies of animals that sometimes are the only thing that some shells can attach to on sandy shores. So you'll find a few little shells there. And then obviously further down on the wet shore, there are usually quite a lot of shells. Some common shells on some shores aren't necessarily quite so common on others. So rarities can be really common elsewhere. And some types of shells have many species. So just knowing the type of shell is actually really quite handy. So these are cockles. There are several species of cockles, quite considerable amount of species of cockles. There's the common prickly spiny Norwegian dog and little at least. The one on the top here is the Norwegian cockle, or the Norway cockle, sorry, at the top. They're often quite orangey and a little bit like they have worn ridges. The two at the sides are common cockles, and then the bottom one is the prickly cockle. These live in the sand, the cockles live in the sand and filter feed, collecting tiny particles. The two main cockles, maybe if you wanted to ID anything, the two main ones that you're likely to find are the prickly cockle, Cockocen bigog, which is the one on the left, and the common cockle, just Cockocen. Being able to ID should be handy. The common cockle can be found in huge numbers in some areas that have mud or silt, like estuaries, but they are common on beach finds, so you'll find them all over. The common cockle lives within the top 5 centimetres of sediment. It never gets to the size of the prickly cockle, which is the one on the left. Prickly cockles have spines from about halfway down on the top of their ridge all the way to the outer edge of their ridge. Even if they're worn away, sometimes you can see that they have this sort of the base of the spine as little dots on the edges of the ridges. Prickly cockles can be very common on certain shores, like the northern end of Cardigan Bay. They also have large gaps in between. So if they are worn, it's the large gaps in between the ridges can be an ID feature as well. So keep an eye out. There are other spiky cockles, which aren't always the prickly cockle. There are a couple of others which are more southern species, but you never know, they could move up. So it's good to get your eye in. This is the piddock or pidog in Welsh. There are a couple of species. One is a non-native and appears to be making inroads into the areas of the smaller native species. The native one appears to be rarer these days. This one has a much more fragile hinge, so you won't often find both shells together, or certainly not attached. These shells are also called angel wings. I don't know whether you can see that from that angle, but facing upright, they look like angel wings when they're split open. And they can burrow into solid rock or peat like this. These are a piddock burrows found on the same shore as the piddock in the picture before, which was Salacra. They have a sharp edge to their shell, and they can, as they move that slowly as they grow, they can start making tunnels into soft rock and solid peat. Yeah, finding shells this big, holes this big, means that it's a good likelihood a piddock has burrowed in at some stage. Mussels or cragen las and limpets or llygad maharen. These are fairly common finds, even though they're more rocky shore species. You do often find them on sandy shores or wherever you are really. There are different species of both, but you'll mostly come across the blue mussel and the common limpet. Both are a favourite of fish and starfish for food, but they themselves feed in very different ways. The limpet grazes for young algae off the rock, and sometimes you can see the scars of the limpet grazing on the rock. There's more on limpets in another training session, so I'm going to leave it there. Mussels like to attach to the rock using threads called byssus. The mussels will filter feed and are known to be pretty good at cleaning seawater. And they produce what's called pseudofeces. This is when the mussel takes in seawater with food and silt, and then it sifts the non-food items within its body and routes it away from the rest of the digestive system and out. So it goes in, but it doesn't quite get digested. So we're thinking that if you called it pseudofeces instead of poo, then you can actually tell kids about poo without their parents being too shocked. This is the pseudofeces here. Fascinating. So there are plenty of small whitish bivalves, loads of them that we're not expecting anybody to ID them. They can be tricky, because they can all be very familiar. But this one is the banded wedge shell, Cragen letem fraith. And it's quite handy because if you run your nail across the bottom, the widest sort of, or the longest point, you can see your nail would make a noise. It has ridges all the way along the bottom, so that's quite handy as an ID feature. And then these, even though I'm saying it's small whitish shells, they do come in white, but sometimes when they're pink, they're really quite handy to as a feature. And these are called the tellin shells. There are plenty of other shells, and there are other things that we can point you to help identify other bivalves. That will come in another training session as well. Some of the bigger bivalves can be slightly easier to identify. This is the Icelandic cyprine, Kokosen vau, and it's a large, quite rounded and really very chunky shell. And actually, even finding the sort of just the top part of this as it's broken up, you can still identify it because it's a really particularly chunky shell. It was discovered to be the longest lived individual organism when Bank University found and counted the rings from one they found in one of their surveys. And it was that one was over 500 years old, and they called it Ming after the Chinese dynasty ruling at the same time it was born. The second shell, it can be mixed up with a couple of other shells, so keep an eye out for blunted gapers and sand gapers, but this one is the otter shell, has a siphon as well, large siphon, and it's commonly covered in this brown sort of very thin layer, like the same as the Icelandic cyprine, and it's called a periostracum, and it flakes off and it makes the shell look a lot more worn once it's flaked off. Other biggie bivalves are the oysters, Wistrasen. You can find bits of oysters as well that can be found on the shore regularly. The native oyster is round, and the shell is really thick. It's built up of layers, and a lot of the time you can find the broken layers on the shore. You can sometimes find oyster shells stuck together too, and this gives an idea about their ecology. They do like to grow on top of one another, and that ultimately makes oyster beds. There are a lot of conservation schemes now trying to re-establish oyster beds, native oyster beds. And we do have an invasive oyster as well called the Pacific oyster, and down in Cornwall, the Pacific oyster has made major inroads and has totally changed some shores, so it's worth keeping an eye out for those. Whelks, this is a common whelk, or Cragen fwyaf. These are the most common whelks by far. They're a really large shell, and they can be quite ridged, as you can see. They can be different colours, but they're mostly fairly pale, creamy colours. They have this acute sense of smell, and it helps them find their favourite prey, which are mussels and cockles, but they can eat a wide range. And then there's the red whelk, and this is a lovely find. It's seen, I think an adult red whelk feels bigger somehow, and they can be quite common on some shores, but these aren't edible, unlike the common whelk, which is what you've just seen. The common whelk is part of the fisheries in the UK, and they're shipped to the Far East for food. Both these animals, this one, the Cragen fwyaf, and this is Cragen goch, both of them create those washball eggs. These are separate male and female animals, and they make those the washball eggs, which are have a horror story about how the babies come out, which is in another Strandline on tour training guide, so I'm going to leave it. As well as stingwinkles, which this one is, there are some other very fancy shells that you can occasionally find. So we've got, this is pelican's foot or yard vor. We've got tusk shells that you can find as well, called corn y fuwch. Other finds, don't expect to know these when you see them, but just know that they're sort of, you know, they could be seen. So it's good to keep your eye out. This is a Hungarian cap, which you can find as well. And then this is a lovely handful of fantastic finds. There is a stingwinkle at the top. There are a couple of them actually. And then we've got the Actian shell, which on some shores is actually more common than others. And then cowries. And depending on whether it's the European cowrie or the spotted cowrie, it's Cragen Vair or Cragen Iago in Welsh. Not all these animals are connected entirely with sandy shore habitats, but you can find their shells in sandy shores, again, usually in the wetter sands. Please do tell us if you've been finding anything, what you're finding, or whether you found something and you want to know what it is. Use our social media pages, please. That will be fantastic. So this is on Facebook, it's Livy Seas Wales on Twitter and on Instagram. And you'll have our emails as well. This is a snapshot, and it's only one of a few videos that we'll be doing to help our volunteers help us. When you're able to safely, or in future when we're all back on track, you can help by spreading the info, letting us know what you're finding on the shore via social media, etc., and then helping us at events with Strandline walks, surveys, and information giving at stalls. And we're really looking forward to seeing all of that soon. Thank you.